Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ynesse Abdul-Malak. I know a lot of you here. Actually, many people I do not know. I am an AUBite. I lived in Lebanon for a few years, and then when I lived there, I enrolled at AUB. I had ended up getting 2 degrees there, a bachelor in environmental health and master's in public health. And then I moved back to the States. I got my PhD in medical sociology. In fact, I met Professor Sawsan Abdulrahim at AUB. She was one of my mentors. We did some work together where we were interviewing domestic workers. We were looking into the access to healthcare in Lebanon. As many of you might be aware, the precarious situation that domestic workers in Lebanon endure while they live there. So today I'm really honored to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Abdulrahim, who's an associate professor in the Department of Health Promotion and Community Health. It's in the Faculty of Health Sciences. She got her doctoral degree from the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In her dissertation, she examined the racial identity formation and the well-being of Arab American business owners in the Detroit area. And she does a lot of research related to social inequalities in health, specifically the social and cultural meanings of subjective health evaluation, and also the structural conditions that influence people's health. And particularly, she's interested in migrants' health. So recently, she's been focusing more on the health of Syrian refugee adolescent girls in Lebanon, where she's looking into their reproductive health outcomes and also early marriage. She teaches courses in health promotion theory, forced migration, health, and global public health. So the way we want to do our little event tonight, Professor Abdulrahim will talk to us a little bit about her research, and I felt like that was very relevant to sort of bring her into the conversation. Some of you might, I don't know if you're aware, but the situation that started, the catalyst that started this social movement with George Floyd, he had gone to a Arab store, and they were the one who called the cops, and what happened after that. And historically, there have been at times some schisms, some tension with Arab store owners and the Black community in general. However, I will let her talk a little bit more and trying to understand where we are now, and specifically what's more important to me in this conversation, it's what kind of role that Arab Americans can play in this current social movement that we are experiencing. And this is not a national conversation, as we could see, it has become global, right? We have it all over the world. People are taking on that cause of social justice. Let's welcome Professor Abdulrahim. I mean, we can virtually clap for her.
Okay, thank you, Ynesse. Thank you, Dr. Abdul-Malak, Professor Abdul-Malak. So yes, Ynesse was one of the students in our program when I first started teaching at AUB, and we worked together on a study with migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. So I'm not an AUB alumnus. I'm actually, I moved to Lebanon when I started working at AUB. I lived in the US for many years before that. And as was mentioned by Ynesse, my dissertation research and some of the work I did relates to Arab Americans in the US and racial identity formation. And I worked with migrant business owners in the Detroit and Detroit metropolitan area. And as many of you know, probably, most of the business owners in Dearborn and Detroit are Lebanese as well. they're immigrants from Lebanon in the US. So the title, Ynesse sent me a title and I changed it into a question. And the question is that, is there a role for Arab Americans in the anti-racism movement arm? I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, but not much more. And then we can have a discussion and have questions. I'll basically, reminisce or go back to some of the work that I did and try to link it to what's happening right now. And let me see if I can change. Yes, okay. You all see the fact that I changed my slide, correct, Ynesse?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so of course, we're talking about anti-racism and the role of Arab Americans in what has been happening in the US in the last few weeks in relationship to the incident, to the murder, the killing of George Floyd, which is related to police brutality, which is something that African Americans have talked about and resisted and suffered from for many decades, and of course in the context of the movement of Black Lives Matter. And why is it important to talk about Arab Americans in this context? I mean, of course, it's important to talk about the role of anybody in the context where an African American man is killed in the middle of the day in front of people with like 4 police officers without like either any of them questioning what is happening or what's going on. But importantly, it's important to address the role of Arab Americans in this context, because George Floyd actually just came out of an Arab-owned business, and it was an Arab immigrant or an Arab person in that business who called the police. This actually reminded me, I asked the question when when the news came out, and then a couple of days later, there was a news article about the business. I asked my question, why did this immigrant call the police? I mean, the story was about $20 of forged $20. And I'm not sure if that's even true, or if that has been, proven that this $20 was forged. And I remembered that when I started my research in Dearborn and Detroit, in particular, I interviewed a lot of Lebanese and other Arab nationalities, other immigrants who have other Arab nationalities, Palestinian, Iraqi, who own gas stations and businesses. And almost all of them said that they don't call the police. They never call the police because the police don't show up. And the police show racism towards them and not only towards their customers, and that they try to resolve issues between them and the customers, and between them and the community in which they work. So I was really asking the question, why in this particular incident, why did the worker call the police? There's been an article published in the New York Times by a professor from I think from the City University of New York. His name is Mustafa Bayoumi, and he wrote excellent books and articles about the racism that Arab immigrants face in the US. And he raised the question of, why did Cup Foods, this is the name of the business, call the cops on George Floyd? I was disappointed in this article because most of it was about the laws around when to call and what to call for, and something called nuisance abatement laws that I actually, when I did my research in Detroit, never heard of, and nobody talked about anything called nuisance abatement laws. But apparently it's a new thing, and businesses in predominantly African American neighborhoods feel that they have to call the police every time there's like a small incident, because otherwise the police would come and accuse the business owner of basically abating or contributing to the nuisance that's happening in the community. Nonetheless, at the end of this article, which focuses a lot on police brutality and nuisance abatement laws, at the end, the author raises the question that, yes, we have all of these things. However, we also need to talk about anti-Black racism in the Arab American community. And that the fact that even though Arabs and Muslims are subjected to racism in the US, they themselves also exert racism against African Americans. Thankfully, I mean, there's this article, although, you know, I think it could have had a stronger focus on Arab, anti-Black Arab racism. But there are also other organizations, other individuals who wrote statements, thankfully, who wrote statements about in support of Black Lives Matter and raising concerns and making statements about anti-Black racism in the Arab American community, in the Muslim community. And I want to highlight that actually there's an organization called the Arab Resource and Organizing Collective, and MISNA, which is a publication it's basically a literary publication by Arab American authors in the US. And they have these events. The first one is in English, which is tomorrow, July 10. And the next one is next week in Farsi. And I looked up the Arabic one on July 24, and they don't have any speakers yet listed under the Arabic. They have speakers for the English and the Farsi events. But basically they have maybe 6 or 7 individuals, most of them are academics, who are going to address or talk about anti-Black racism in Arab, North African, Middle East, and Iranian communities. There are also individuals who made statements in support of Black Lives Matter and mentioning anti-Arab racism, which was heartening because, you know, there's a denial in general about anti-Black racism among the Arab American community. I mean, that's my opinion, of course, but that's also in many other immigrant communities. There's this sense of denial that it's not about racism directed by the immigrants towards African Americans, and there's this discourse that immigrants come here and we work hard, and why can't African Americans work hard and persevere and do the things that we do? And there's this, victim blaming and basically putting the blame on individuals that have suffered from structural and systemic racism for a long time, and basically using the argument that, well, immigrants make it in America, so how come one group doesn't make it? So what I want to do is I want to talk about three concepts or 3 issues in the remainder of the time, and very quickly, so I leave time for Ynesse and for others to raise questions and discuss and express their views. And the 3 things that I want to talk about are, the first thing is what's called the Middleman Minority, which I assume most of the people who are attending this seminar do not belong to this category of what's called Middleman Minority. But this is something that I studied, and that has been written about a lot in sociology. And this is basically a phenomenon that describes immigrants, or in some cases not necessarily immigrants, who come into a situation that is divided by race, such as the context in the US, where there's racial segregation, and there are racial segregation physically, in terms of residential neighborhoods, in terms of schools, and there's a split, what's called a split labor market. For example, whites are channeled into certain jobs and certain sectors in the economy, African Americans are channeled into the low wage service sector, for example. So the immigrant comes into this situation, and the immigrants who have what's called social capital, meaning or human capital, not only social capital, human capital, immigrants who are educated, who have an education from their country of origin, who speak English well, who have some skills and maybe capital, money, they can save themselves and they can get integrated into the mainstream economy and interact with mostly white employers, white employees. There are other immigrants, however, who come, whether they come from Korea or they come from India or they come from Arab countries, who do not possess the human capital in terms of education and skills, and they integrate themselves into what's called the Middleman Minority sector, which basically is stores that open in predominantly African American neighborhoods and inner cities in the US. There's a focus on liquor stores, but some stores actually don't necessarily sell liquor. They're called corner stores. In Detroit, for example, Lebanese immigrants basically own gas stations and not liquor stores, and they don't sell liquor. They sell lottery tickets, they sell other things, but they don't sell liquor. And this is a problematic structural position to be in, because here you have an immigrant group that becomes sandwiched between the white basically system that keeps African Americans down, segregated, oppressed, prevented from social mobility. But at the same time, this immigrant group is also not accepted into the white mainstream. So they are sandwiched in this position. And in the 1990s, there were race riots that happened in Los Angeles. In the 1960s, there were race riots that took place in Detroit. And the owners of these small businesses in inner cities, whatever their ethnic background is, they may be Jewish, they may be Italian. In Los Angeles, they were Korean, mostly Korean. And now, in many inner cities, the owners are of Arab or Chaldean origin, the immigrant group. So they are the brunt, of being in that position. They contribute basically to the maintenance of segregation and structural inequalities, but at the same time, they also bear the brunt in, when there's a race riot or there are protests or demonstrations against police brutality in inner cities. These businesses are also seen as the enemy, because they are seen as outsiders coming in. They're seeping the resources of the African American community. The food, by the way, and the products in these businesses are much more expensive than buying from large supermarkets in mainstream white neighborhoods. A lot of these places also rely a lot on selling liquor, on selling tobacco, on selling things that community members use to consume drugs, for example. I found out in my study 15 years ago in Detroit that there are certain types of papers and Ziploc bags, small Ziploc bags, certain types of tobacco that are sold, and the owner knows that these things are sold to be used to smoke weed and not tobacco. So this is the first concept I want to talk about, and that's when you think about cup foods and their position and how this whole incident with George Floyd happened. This is a typical situation of a middleman minority business that is interfacing with African Americans in inner cities, and it just happened that this owner or the person who worked in this business called the police, and that's when the incident happened. The police came in, and it ended in the killing of George Floyd. I'm not sure, nobody knows, did the business owner, not the business owner, I'm sorry, the young guy who called the police, did this person, is it a new immigrant? Did this person understand the consequences of calling the police on a Black man in that context? I mean, nobody knows. I don't know if the consequences of this act were understood by the person who called 911 on the police or not. And of course, we don't know how the owners feel right now. And we know that their business has been shut since then, since that incident. So that's the first concept I wanted to talk about that relates to this, to the situation and the incident of the killing of George Floyd by a police officer. The other concept I want to talk about, which is really important in the context of Arab Americans, and which actually I worked on with very, very little support from people who work on Arab Americans, unfortunately. And this is the concept of the idea of whiteness, or wanting to become white in America. This is written, very few writings on Arab immigrants address this issue. The issue, I mean, all of you know that Arab immigrants or immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East can check the white category on the census, and they can identify as white. Of course, Arab immigrants from different countries have very different phenotypes and skin color and everything. But there are many Arab immigrants who can definitely pass as white with respect to skin color. Actually, the data shows that a majority of Arab immigrants or Arab Americans select the white category. But it's not only about selecting the white category on the census or on official forms. It's also about identifying, and what does this identity mean? Who seeks to become white? What does it mean to them? And then how does it relate to what they achieve, their trajectory in the United States, what they achieve in life, and what happens to them. So there are these really excellent books, the one called Wages of Whiteness, which talks about how working class whites in factories in America actually emphasize so much their whiteness at the expense of their class interests. During a very important period of time when the unions in the US were strong. The other book that is really groundbreaking is on how the Irish became white. And it basically tells the story of how the Irish were seen as European Black or Negroes, in quotes, of course. But then over time, they were able to become white. And there's a process, and that process basically took place with the active involvement of the Irish who wanted to become white. And then there's a really good book that doesn't receive a lot of attention in the writings on Arab Americans called Between Arab and White by someone who's not Arab American. But basically this book describes how at the turn of the 20th century, Syrian and Lebanese immigrants in the US actually fought to become white. They were categorized as Asians. And that was a time where the US had what's called the yellow scare. And they wanted to reject Asians and strip them of the right to immigrate to the US and strip them of citizenship rights. So the Lebanese and Syrian immigrants, at the beginning, Lebanese and Syrian immigrants argued that they are Christian, and as Christian, they should naturally become white in the US. That didn't help them. So then, this book describes how their arguments changed over time after they saw that, they were saying they're Christian and then they weren't getting citizenship, right? Then they said, okay, we need to change our arguments. Then they started to say that we're not Asian. We are, the Lebanese and the Syrians have nothing to do with Turkey or the Ottomans, have nothing to do with Asians. So we should, and we're not Black, of course. That's the main argument that they presented. And then they started to get citizenship. So that went on for a long time until the 1960s, and later on, issues related to global politics and Israel and Palestine and the demonization of Arabs in the US then basically Arab American organizations that were recently formed started to talk about the racism that Arab immigrants are facing and the fact that they don't fit into the white category because of all the racism they encounter. And until now, there has been a consistent, basically movement towards identifying by Arab Americans themselves to identify as non-white or to move outside the white category. There are people who are very convinced that this is a good thing, and this serves Arab Americans, but there are also people who are critical of this because it's basically saying that yes, there are races that are white, there's white and there's non-white, and we just want to move from the white to the non-white. So they're not problematizing the whole system of racial stratification in the US. They're just saying that we just don't fit into the white category now. There is a white category and there's a black category, and we just want to be moved. Not into the black category. They're asking for their own category called Middle Eastern or Arab American. And the other thing is the fact that actually this movement to take the Arab Americans outside the white category is primarily by middle class US-born Arab Americans. But in fact, from my research, the majority of immigrants want to identify as white. And there's data that shows that 67% of immigrants do check the white category on the census. So that's the second concept I wanted to address related to the issue that we're talking about of the George Floyd incident, the role of the Arab business, Arab immigrants, and now talking about anti-racism. Of course, we cannot judge that the business that called the police, the individuals, are racists, or they are consciously acting in a racist manner. I'm not sure how threatened. I don't think the individual who was working in the business was threatened at all, because George Floyd paid the $20 and left the business. They followed him. They went after him. It's not like he was inside threatening anyone. I mean, I've interviewed individuals in Detroit who say that we are threatened all the time. I was in a situation where the business owner was physically threatened by a customer, and he tried to calm things down and basically most of them at that time said that they don't call the police. But anyways, the situation, that I think is, or the question that I think is really important to ask is whether Arab Americans can participate in this project, this anti-racist project in the US, even as immigrants who are facing racism themselves and discrimination and stereotyping, whether Muslims or non-Muslims. Is it possible that they participate in an anti-racist project, which may come at the expense of their own financial, economic interests in the US? Because, a lot of immigrants come to the US and they make a living out of this structural position, out of being, in this middleman minority group and owning businesses in inner city neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods in the US. And by the way, their children move out. So it's basically the first generation that owns these businesses. And then their children get an education and move out. And then it's the next immigrant group that comes and buys these businesses and achieves social mobility from them. And African Americans see this and they say, okay, we're here. We see immigrants come in, they do well, they leave. Another group of immigrants come in and they leave. And our neighborhoods are getting more and more impoverished. Okay, so what is anti-racism? the question again is whether Arab immigrants, irrespective of how they experience the US or racism in the US, can they proactively engage in a process of anti-racism? And what that requires is that they need to, I'm not getting on my soapbox here or telling people what to do, but basically in order to participate in an anti-racist project, one at the minimum level, at the first level, needs to identify and challenge racism. People need to acknowledge it and need to not deny its existence and give reasons for the conditions, you know, of African Americans in the US. One needs to identify it and challenge it and work towards eliminating it as well. It's important to acknowledge also that racism is both interpersonal. So you can be a nice person and not use the N-word and not, you know, have a negative attitude or at least express a negative attitude. But it's also important to acknowledge that racism is structural and systemic, and immigrants sometimes benefit from the, you know, the structures that have been entrenched through the, you know, historically in the US. Then also acknowledging that racialized groups have less power and privileges, rather than thinking, you know, in some discourse that affirmative action, for example, is a privilege, and some people are, you know, are excluded because they're not Black, and Blacks have privileges. I mean, I don't know if there are any universities now that can still have affirmative action. When I was an undergraduate, the university I went to lost affirmative action. When I was doing my PhD, University of Michigan lost affirmative action. So I don't know if affirmative action is, Ynesse would know more about this. But there is this sense that, you know, things like affirmative action, for example, privilege people of color, even though they're basically, I don't know if I would call it Band-Aid solutions, but it's basically policies to rectify historical oppression and exclusion. And then it's important to think of anti-racism outside the box of multiculturalism or diversity. When I was a student, there was a lot of focus on multiculturalism and diversity, and we just want to bring, you know, students from different backgrounds, but then you bring them in, then it makes you look good as an institution, as a university. But if there are no programs that work on basically dismantling racism at the institution, then you're making it more difficult for these young people to come in. Actually, this is happening at the AUB as well. They're recruiting, or for the past few years, they've been recruiting students from Africa because there are scholarships. And some of the students from Africa have expressed, you know, have talked about the really negative experiences that they had, not only outside on the street, but also in the classroom at AUB. So if you can't have basically work on dismantling racism, then this whole notion of multiculturalism and putting people together loses its meaning or its effect. So where to begin, you know? And, you know, I always, in the field of public health, I'm in public health, as Ynesse mentioned. In the field of public health, we always say, don't talk about raising awareness. Don't talk about improving people's knowledge, because in most cases, people know, you know, and it's not about knowledge and raising awareness. There are other factors that prevent people from adopting healthy behavior, and we need to address those rather than to treat people like children and tell them what's good for them or give them knowledge. But in this case, I would say that one of the first steps that need to be done, is basically knowledge, increasing knowledge of the conditions or the history of African Americans in the US. I'm focusing on African Americans, but of course this applies to other, indigenous populations, to other immigrant groups, Latino immigrants, or Latino indigenous people in North America. But knowledge is really important because a lot of immigrants arrive to the US with almost no knowledge of the history of the US, and they think that the US is what they see in Hollywood movies, and particular Hollywood movies, and they don't understand the history of enslavement or slavery, and what it has done to the US, how it has accumulated capital and wealth in the US at the expense of a group of people who basically provided the labor in order to make the US the wealthiest nation in the world. And then when slavery ended, basically there was the Jim Crow system that physically and through policy, intentional policy, basically separated African Americans from whites and prevented them from accessing resources and accessing spaces that can help them, get out of basically address the outcomes of slavery and try to move ahead in life. Sorry, I'm 10 minutes late. But part of Jim Crow actually was the segregation, the physical segregation of schools, residential neighborhoods, and the redlining, basically preventing African Americans from purchasing property or housing in certain neighborhoods in order to keep these neighborhoods for whites, which basically depressed African Americans and kept them in certain areas or in certain neighborhoods that were bereft of resources and were, such as areas like inner city Detroit or some other inner city neighborhoods in cities like Chicago or other places in the US. Then in raising knowledge about policing and incarceration, because there's also this sense of immigrants feeling secure in the presence of police, which is not the experience of African Americans. And there's a history of policing and incarceration. There's an author, Angela Davis, who wrote a lot on incarceration, others, of course, and the fact that the majority of individuals who are incarcerated in the US are African Americans for petty crimes or misdemeanors sometimes. If anybody has visited San Francisco and has visited Alcatraz, you will notice that Alcatraz, because it was a prison for really very serious crimes like murders and serial killers, and there were no African Americans or Blacks in Alcatraz. None of the prisoners were Black. They were all white. So the prisons are full, the other prisons, the mega prisons, are full of Black young men who have committed petty crimes or engaged in petty crimes as an outcome of structural conditions, growing up in poverty or being excluded. But in fact, if the data shows that African Americans are very underrepresented in murders or high crimes, for example. Okay, and then the other thing that is important to acknowledge in any anti-racist project is to acknowledge how whiteness shaped the trajectories of immigrants. So now, I don't mean to be very critical, but now the second and third generation Arab Americans who are calling to be removed outside the white category and saying that we are people of color, these are the children and grandchildren of people who came to the US, who asked to be white and who benefited from whiteness. And now their children and grandchildren are saying, oh, now, in the post-civil rights era, we don't want to be white, And they are people who are academics, who are directors of Arab American institutions. I'm not saying that Arab Americans should be white, but I'm just problematizing that whole idea of saying, well, now that I benefited from whiteness, I don't want Arab Americans to be white anymore because we don't feel comfortable with that, even emotionally. We don't feel comfortable with it. we want to identify as people of color. So that's what I want to end. But before I end talking about the US, I also want to mention that because of the my positionality and where I work, that it sometimes becomes uncomfortable to critique and talk about racism in the US without linking it to racism that we enact and participate in here. And I just wanted to mention we're talking about anti-racism. There's also an organization in Lebanon called the Anti-Racism Movement. And most of the work that they do relates to the kafala system, the sponsorship system that brings women from low-income countries to work in Lebanon as domestic workers. That's a project that Ynesse and I worked on maybe a decade ago. And again, in order to proactively partake in anti-racism, one has to link things together and to think about what's happening in the US and also the racism that takes place in Lebanon and of course other Arab countries, racism towards people of color and from low-income countries as well. So I want to end here and open it for discussion and questions. I apologize that I'm leaving 15 minutes but we can stay longer. It's fine. I'm not sleepy.
Okay. Thank you so much for this vibrant discussion. So I forgot to mention, so if you have any questions, you can write it on the chat box and I can read the question out. Or you can raise your hand. For those of you who know how to use Zoom, there is a raise hand feature that I'll be able to see who's asking question. But while you're trying to figure this out, I just wanted to reiterate something that Sawsan mentioned about the history of African American in this country. I mean, you have to understand, like African Americans here, they were enslaved for over 200 years, about 246 years. And then it followed by another 100 years of legal disenfranchisement and extra legal intimidation. So even when the Civil Rights Act was passed in the mid-1960s, so you could see African Americans have really been free. Still, I mean, some people will argue that they're not free from 1960s on. So the last 3 centuries almost, they have been enslaved. So when Arab Americans try to compare themselves to African American, they miss in the historical context of it, where African Americans have been marginalized and oppressed for so long. And I have to say, as someone who has been in the Arab world, at times when I talk about racism, especially in Lebanon, Lebanese like to say that it's not really racism, Lebanese, it's about sectarianism, they different religion, they treat them differently. And they don't really try to understand the historical component of what's happening here in the US. And this is one of the things that I wanted to emphasize. And as Sawsan mentioned, that your whiteness have somewhat protected you of some of the marginalization that African American have experienced over decades here. So we have a couple of questions. I will read the first one. Maybe it's not a question. It's from David Shomer. We should be discussing more what we can do as Arab Americans to overcome racism, such as investing in the communities of color, like one of our friend here, Mustafa, is doing here in Syracuse. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk to that, Sawsan, about investing in the community.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's a minimum, for people who have businesses in African American neighborhoods, is investing in that community from the profit that an individual makes from that business is to be expected, is a minimum thing that business owners can do.
Yeah. So we have an anonymous question where the person said, do you find that there has been growing solidarity between Black and Arab communities in the Black Lives Matter era. I know activists in occupied Palestine and BLM have supported each other's movements. Angela Davis was a great supporter of Palestinian rights.
Absolutely. I think, yes, there is solidarity between BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, pro-Palestine activists, and Black Lives Matter. There's a Palestinian activist whose name is Noura Erakat, who has basically done a lot of work in terms of bridging with the African American community and linking basically the Palestinian struggle with the struggle of African Americans, particularly in terms of police brutality in the U.S. So yes, absolutely. I think, and of course, Angela Davis put herself on the line, basically. I mean, she's very well known, very well respected, but she has spoken up for Palestine in context where where it was difficult to talk about Palestine. I've seen her actually at one of the American Public Health Associations talking about Palestine, and I've seen people leave the room. Although she's extremely well respected in the public health community because she talks about incarceration and prisons and incarceration is a public health issue. And even though, despite that, there were people who left the room because she started to talk about Palestine. So yes, there's solidarity. I hope that this solidarity grows stronger, and I hope to see it become at the level of communities and not only specific individuals who have clear social justice perspectives. I hope that it will become more reflect more like solidarity between the communities and not just individuals.
Yeah, thank you. And another question from Jad. So can we take a moment to draw a parallel between slavery in the Arab world and parallel to slavery in the Americas in order to be more aware of our bias as Arab Americans, of our own embedded potential racism? So I guess it's more of a statement that we should be aware of slavery in the Arab world. Actually, when I was preparing a little bit for this event today, I started looking up, even during the slave trades. We know the Arabs played a major role in slave trading. Yes, and I know you mentioned like potential racism. I mean, I can tell you, having lived in Beirut, Lebanon, it is pretty much there and alive, racism in the Arab world.
So as I grew up, Ynesse, I want to say that, I'm born in 1975. As a kid, I didn't know the difference between the word Abid and the word Aswad. Or, I don't even know why that word exists in the first place, right? But Abid, or someone from Africa. So and I think that I've heard this from many people, that we in our education almost have been taught to take both of these as one, and that's a huge problem that we have. And there is some data apparently that tends to point to the fact that slavery was extensive in the Arab world from Africa, and the number as well, it might not be as institutionalized at a large scale as in the US, but some numbers might point to a larger number of slaves in the Arab world than in the US. And I was wondering, I'm not an expert, and I was wondering whether we could maybe look at that a little bit so that we are aware of our own bias, which probably does not help us as Arabs, as Lebanese, and also as Lebanese Christians, and I'm one of them, to help the African American community.
Yeah, I mean, I would let Sawsan talk more about it, but I remember in our research, we did have a question asking the domestic workers. I mean, we were interviewing West African domestic workers in Lebanon, and it was one of the questions I don't remember if you remember, Sawsan, we're asking them, how do they feel about the word Abed? And I remember a few of them, I mean, they were using it to them as the N-word, basically. And there was a difference between Abed and Aswad. I know at that moment, but perhaps Sawsan, you do more work like this, you can talk more on that than I can.
So there are a couple of really good books. There's no way I can remember titles and authors' names now, but there are a couple of good books on the history of the Arab and Muslim involvement in the slave trade. And I think these are really important to read and understand, like in parallel to understanding the experience of African Americans with slavery in the US. And yes, of course, there was slavery historically in the Arab region. And now, of course, there are people who refer to the kafala system, or the system of recruiting, hiring, and employing migrant domestic workers as modern day slavery, because of the fact, that it involves holding the employee in a relationship with the employer throughout their residency in Lebanon. So the employee cannot leave the work situation if the employer doesn't want them to leave. So that's basically forced labor and enslavement. I think it's important to draw parallels, and that's why the point that I ended with, that it's important to link our critique of racism in the US with a critique of the racism in Lebanon and in the Arab region, historically, and also current things that are taking place currently in the Arab region. Now what is happening with, I'm sure all of you know about the economic collapse and free fall that Lebanon is experiencing. And a lot of families cannot afford to pay the migrant workers that they hire their wages. So they're leaving them. They're leaving them on the street, basically. I don't know the numbers, but at least there's one news clip that shows 20 to 30 Ethiopian migrant workers who are on the street in front of their embassy. And these are women who were abandoned by their employer. So if we want to be consistent with ourselves and talk about racism in the US, it's also important to talk about racism at the same time in our context.
Yeah, so we have a question here, and then we have David with his hand up. Let me just read the question. Say, do you find that more Lebanese youth, specifically those who are part of the Thawra, are they fighting for the rights of Black/Asian people who suffer under the kafala system?
So the revolution of October 17th, there were young people who were chanting, and they were mostly young feminists whose chants were in support of granting, people of color, domestic workers, migrant women, refugees, equal rights in Lebanon, and who were have scathing critiques of Lebanese politicians who use basically who make racist statements against refugees and migrant workers and blame them for the economic downfall in Lebanon. So yes, I think there's a shift. I think young people who participated in the revolution have a different perspective of where the problem is, and the problem lies in the corruption of the politicians. It's not in the fact that there are refugees or migrant workers in Lebanon.
All right, David, go ahead.
Well, first, thank you, Ynesse and Sawsan, for a very good presentation that is absolutely needed at this time. We are Arab Americans that are alumni from an institution that's an American institution of higher education that has allowed us to really see the world and see history and learn from it. Right now, we are facing a world that is in turmoil. It's in flux. And it's extremely important that we use our education that we had from the American University in order to see things correctly. I think we need to use correct language. I don't think this is a fight about racism. This is about slavery. The slavery that we overcame was the physical slavery. We are now trying to overcome economic slavery. This is what ties the worker in Lebanon to the African American in the United States, to the people that are poor around the world. It's economic slavery. And we need to find ways in which we unite people, we unite ourselves, and be part of the solution. That's why I suggested that if we are looking for solutions, which we need to, because we are the ones that have the education that allows us to speak up and gave us the positions that we have. We need to address the actual problem correctly, this economic slavery. And we need to address some solutions towards that, such as investing in places where that investment can be positive and release the change of economic slavery on some. It is so obvious to me what Mustafa has done with the clinic, and not only Mustafa, I mean the team has done with the clinic, is astoundingly, people are silent about it. We need to be from the rooftops screaming, this is what needs to be done. That the owners of the shops that are in African-American neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, not necessarily only African-American, these are the customers. What business do you know of that does not bring back some money from what they made from their customers to their customers, invest in them so that they can get positive backfeed from the community and they become part and members of the community, teaching them. This is, I think, what we need to concentrate on. Just talking about racism is I think, past its time. We need to concentrate on in social enslavement, economic enslavement that we're going through right now.
Thank you, David. But I really don't think they are mutually exclusive, right? You can still talk about both, because I feel like the danger, it's a bit dangerous when you say, let's not talk about racism, let's talk about more the economic part of it. Yes, the economic part of it is a major part, but we know that racism plays a major role when it comes to disenfranchisement of African Americans, right? I mean, even if you look at policing, I mean, this has nothing to do with economic, right? And you know, Black people are more likely to be stopped by the cops, more likely to get ticketed. Even after they get ticketed, more likely to have, longer prison sentence, more likely to be in death row. So, I mean, there are so many things that are not purely economic based that create this kind of disparity we have. So yes, we should be looking into economic. However, the race part is a major component, because when we start going post-racial and the colorblind, this is when we start losing the important thing. I know we kind of passed time, because I know I don't want to hold people up past the 4 o'clock line, but there was a question here from Maya that I just want to read it before we have to go. She said, when I lived in Beirut, I tutored a family where the husband worked as a UN diplomat. The wife will complain to me that she will go to the grocery store and people will ask her, where is your madam? This is the story of my life, Maya. When a madam was every day. When a madam, whenever they saw me on the street or they knock at my door. They didn't realize that she was the wife of a diplomat, and because of the kafala systems, therefore they treat her the way they will treat their maid. And Maya's question, like, how do we start this cultural shift in Lebanon? And I'm glad you asked that question, Maya. I was in Lebanon. I was in a great economic situation, but that did not shield me from the racism that I experience every day on the street or people knocking at my door. So I think David's point is right. We should be focusing on economic situation. However, we cannot completely ignore the racist part of it, the racial part of it. But anyway, I don't know if somebody have one last thing they have to say, because I like to be mindful of time.
I just want to add, Ynesse, that I mean, the history of U.S. cities is about how the economic and the racial intertwine. So it's not only about economics. I mean, the history of Detroit, for example, and the white flight, and the fact that Ford Motor Company did not allow, Ford Motor Company in Dearborn did not allow Blacks to stay in Dearborn. They had to go back to Detroit. And the fact that the automobile companies left Black cities or areas or neighborhoods where Blacks lived, this is all, indicative of how the economics and the racist policies intertwine and ended up creating the situation that exists in the U.S. inner cities right now.
I have a question. I'm Barbara Johnson, or I was Barbara Johnson, class of '63. My question relates to the Afghan women contingent that AUB has brought on campus. How were they considered within this racist spectrum of what's on campus?
I mean, we had in my department, we had two graduate female students from Afghanistan. They were amazing. They were amazing. But I know that that there are, like last year, there were maybe 20 or more than 20 undergraduate students from Afghanistan who came to AUB. I don't know much really about how they're experiencing AUB or living in Lebanon. Last year was, I mean, a really strange year for everyone. But I mean, I think they would have a different experience compared to African students. There are scholarships that bring African students also to Lebanon, and the Afghan female students would not have had the same experiences as African students.
No.
Because of skin color, it's a different thing.
Okay. All right. So if we don't have any last minute thing to say, I'm gonna say thank you, and let's just say thank you to Sawsan for staying up. It's past 11 o'clock there, and then under the generator, you're still able to give such a...
Yes, the electricity didn't go off, so we're lucky.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everyone. We had about 32 people here, so that was really great. Thank you for participating, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you, Sawsan.
Thanks.